Hello and welcome to this overview of the AQA GCSE history content, covering Part 1 of the America, Opportunity and Inequality course, covering the boom, social and cultural developments, and the divided society. We are going to be covering the content quite quickly, so if there is anything that you are unsure about, make sure to pause the video, take a note, and go back over it later. To begin with, we are going to look at a bit of background information about the Americans, which will help us later on. As you may know from your other studies, the American colonies broke free from British rule in 1776, creating what we now know as the United States of America. With this freedom, the Americans set up a constitution, a set of rules describing how the country should be run. Two governments were then set up, the federal government, which dealt with national, countrywide affairs, and state governments, which ran and made laws for each state individually. The federal government consisted of a president, elected every 4 years, a cabinet of advisors, and Congress. Americans voted for their own state government, applying different laws to different areas of the country. In addition, there were two main parties to vote for: the Republican Party, who liked to stay out of people's lives, avoiding high taxes, which was popular with the rich, and the Democratic Party, which preferred to intervene with people's lives, helping those in need. It is important that you are also aware of the Bill of Rights, the first part of the Constitution. This highlighted the importance of a number of rights, including the freedom of belief, information, law, protection, speech, and assembly. Many states still ignored some of these rights, especially in regards to the racial discrimination of African Americans and Native Americans. To finish our background information section, we are going to talk about the variety of people found in America in the 1920s. The first Americans, often known as Native Americans, had lived in tribes in America for thousands of years, before the European settlers forced them into reservations, taking the natives' land for their own. As a result, the number of natives drastically dropped to just 250,000 in 1900. The European settlers began to arrive in America in the 1600s, taking the land as their own. The British were the largest group of white settlers, and so America soon became regarded as part of the British Empire. As previously mentioned, the natives broke free from British rule in 1776, although the British still maintained significant power, in terms of money, politics, and influence. The next group to talk about is the African Americans, who descended from the millions of slaves taken from Africa to work on American farms. Many, despite the fact that slavery was abolished in 1865, faced severe discrimination in education, employment, housing, and other sectors. From the 1850s, new waves of immigrants began to enter America, the majority coming from Eastern and Southern Europe. These people crossed into America in search of a better life, looking for work in large towns and cities. Other migrants, from all over the world, including countries such as China, Japan, Mexico, and Cuba, just to name a few, fled to America, all looking for a better life than where they left. This takes us on to the first part of the specification, the boom. Before we talk about the effects, we must first consider the wide number of influences that led towards this boom in the 1920s. The USA initially followed a policy of isolationism during the First World War, which we will see later on as well, before joining in 1917 on Britain's side. Unlike countries like France, America remained distant from the conflict, with no territorial damage or significant loss of infrastructure. This meant that the Americans were able to profit significantly from the war, selling basic goods that many could no longer produce, alongside war essentials and new inventions, all aiding the American economy. For example, 50% of the world's wood, 55% of the world's cotton, and 70% of the world's petrol was made by the USA in 1920. Next up is what was known as the Consumer Society. A significant increase in the usage of electricity in homes led to the availability of home technologies, like washing machines, vacuum cleaners, refrigerators, and more, which leads us onto the cycle of prosperity. An increased demand for these goods meant factories needed more workers, decreasing unemployment, and increasing pay, because the factories made lots of money. This meant people had more disposable income to buy more goods, completing the cycle. In addition, other factors, such as those about the government, played a role in the boom. The Republican government of the time set up many new policies, including the Fordner-McCumber Tariff Act, placing high taxes on items entering the country. This meant that people were more likely to buy a cheaper American item than a more expensive imported item, helping the economy. The government additionally decreased taxes, allowing companies to create more jobs, and the poor to have more disposable income. America also had a number of growing industries at the time, especially the motor industry. More jobs were created as the demand for cars increased, and the newly popularized assembly line allowed unskilled workers to complete one task in a process, decreasing the production time of many items. Henry Ford was the leading figure in popularizing this method of production, inspired by a similar system he had seen in a meat-packing factory. A platform, carrying the car that was being constructed, moved through the factory, with each worker doing one simple job to it. The simplicity of Ford's Model T vehicles meant that they could be produced affordably and quickly. This had huge impacts all over the country. 15 million people bought a Model T between 1911 and 1929, which meant other jobs sprung up too, such as those building roads, supplying fuel, creating roadside hotels, and maintaining the cars. The final reason for the boom that we will look at is the improved ways to buy and sell. Adverts filled billboards, newspapers, and radio programs, urging people to buy the latest goods. Catalogs allowed items to be selected and delivered straight to your house, revolutionary at the time. Hire purchase plans, or buy now, pay later initiatives, meant large items were affordable, as the cost was spread over multiple payments. We are now going to talk about those who didn't benefit from the boom. To start with, many in the countryside, especially farmers, struggled after World War I, when their produce was no longer required by European nations. New machinery was so effective that it produced too much food, reducing its value and leaving much unsold. Many had borrowed money to buy this equipment, and now couldn't afford to pay back the loan, so lost their entire livelihood. Over 600,000 lost their farms in 1924. The next group that didn't benefit from the boom was those who worked in traditional industries, like cotton and wool factories. These workers, along with coal miners, found a lack of need for their services as modern alternatives developed, many finding themselves with less pay, or out of a job. Many African Americans also did not benefit from the boom. A large majority of them worked on farms in southern states, facing poor conditions and significant poverty. Not only was the farming industry struggling, but these groups faced relentless discrimination, including when trying to get another job. Native Americans faced struggles during this period too. The traditional tribes had been forced onto reservations while mining companies took their land. The reservations were often made of infertile land, reducing farming opportunities, while education was very poor and the life expectancy was very low. The combination of these struggling groups created a vast wealth divide. The wealthiest 5% of the country owned a third of all the money. Many families were still not paid a fair salary, restricting the products they could buy and the essentials that they could afford, all the while contributing to the massive profits of large companies. Next, we are going to talk about the stock market, and how many made significant amounts of money by what was known as playing the stock market. This involved buying shares in a business at a certain price, and as the business made more money, and became worth more, so did the share. The share could then be sold for a higher price than it was bought, profiting the buyer. At this time, most companies were flourishing, and so people saw huge growth in the value of their shares. This was accessed by those of less wealth through a system known as a buying on the margin, which meant that a loan was taken out to pay for a share in a company before being repaid, along with the interest, with the profit made from the stock. 5 times as many people owned stocks in 1929 than in 1920. It was seen as a great way to make money. We are now going to move on to the period of time known as the Roaring Twenties, in which vast improvements were noticed throughout society, be that in entertainment, partying or music. There were many crazes flying around in the 20s, with people becoming obsessed with a variety of things like crosswords, marathon dancing, dancing for as long as possible, and more. Sport also took a large turn for the better in the 20s, with sports people becoming celebrities for the first time, and therefore earning lots of money. Many people had radios in their homes, which, along with newspapers and magazines, helped bring sporting events to millions. The 20s were also known for their music, jazz in particular. Starting in the southern states among African Americans, jazz became well known and popular for its often fast tempos and lively rhythms, appealing especially to the young. The popularity of this music in bars, nightclubs, and other venues led to new styles of dance emerging too. Dances such as the Charleston and the tango soon became popular, renouncing the slower, more traditional dances. Many black musicians found fame and money through jazz too, such as Louis Armstrong. Cinema also became very popular, with over 100 million people going to the cinema every week in 1930. This was a result of what was known as the star system. A film would advertise the main actors in it, drawing in fans of the person rather than drawing them to the movie itself. This allowed many actors to become famous, household names, like Charlie Chaplin. Chaplin was an actor who became well known for his slapstick comedy character in the silent film era, before going on to become a successful film director. New technologies allowed for the emergence of talkies, films with talking, which didn't exist until 1927. This increased audience sizes once again, although many lost their popularity if they had a strange voice, which was previously unheard. With this increase in movies came an increase in sexual content, which concerned many of the older generations. To retain popularity, Hollywood created a set of rules, the Hays Code, that censored the movies, banning nudity, kisses longer than 3 seconds, and profit from crimes like arson or murder, for fear that people would copy their actions. Next up is how women's lives were changing in the 1920s. Before World War I, women had to wear long skirts, to not reveal too much skin, weren't allowed to play many sports, wore little makeup, couldn't go out without a man, especially those of the upper classes, couldn't smoke, couldn't vote, and those who had to work could often only find low-paid, low-skilled labor. World War I changed a lot of this. With men away fighting, women were left to do the jobs that they were previously not allowed to. This allowed women to earn money and gain a greater level of independence, leading to them being able to vote in 1920. The divorce rate doubled in the 1920s, as women had more money to live alone, and had a greater confidence around men. This led to the development of a new type of woman, the flapper. This type of women rebelled against traditional values, often wearing revealing clothes, going on dates alone, smoking and drinking in public, as well as often riding motorbikes and going to nightclubs. The Anti-Flirt League was set up, demonstrating the shock among many traditional Americans towards this new generation of women. However, not all women benefited from these changes in the 1920s. There were many barriers to voting, like literacy tests, which stopped many, while women did still not play a key role in national politics. Contraception became more widely available, giving women more choice about their body, although this was banned in some states for religious concerns, sanctity of life. Despite the number of employed women increasing by 25% over the 1920s, many were still paid less and confined to stereotypical women's jobs. Those of the lower class often did not get involved in the flapper movement, while those in the countryside retained their more traditional way of living, isolated from the large cities. This demonstrates how not all women felt the benefits of the 1920s. Let's move on to the next section, divided society. First, we will talk about Prohibition and why it failed. Prohibition stopped anyone in America from selling, making, or transporting most alcoholic drinks, anything over 0.5% alcohol. This had been wanted for many years from groups like the Anti-Saloon League, who had much religious support, claiming that alcohol caused a number of problems like poverty and addiction. The government faced a large problem enforcing this. By 1930, there were 3,000 agents tasked to enforce it, but it was almost impossible to stop alcohol being smuggled into the country, whether on the coastlines or the borders with Mexico and Canada. People still wanted to drink, and so continued to do so however possible despite the law. Criminal gangs smuggled in alcohol with bootleggers, and sold it in illegal bars called speakeasies, while those caught breaking this law were often not punished. Many also made moonshine, a homemade alcohol which was unregulated, and so often caused serious health problems. These details were recorded in the Wickersham Commission in 1929, commissioned by President Herbert Hoover. When Roosevelt was elected in 1932, one of the first things he did was get rid of prohibition, in early 1933, meaning people could legally drink again. However, Prohibition brought about many criminal gangs that maintained great power in large cities, and here we see the figure of Al Capone become prominent. Born to immigrant parents, Alphonse Capone was excluded from school and soon joined a young street gang in his neighborhood. In 1919, Al moved to Chicago and joined a gang, soon taking over some other gangs, alongside Johnny Torrio. The two of them were soon making lots of money from bootlegging, fixing races, and racketeering, a type of fraud. Al was very well known, showing off his wealth at every opportunity, and yet was never convicted, despite being arrested several times, as no witnesses ever came forward. Torrio retired in 1925, and Al took over aged 26, with many bodyguards and a bulletproof car to protect him. He employed 700 people by 1927, helping to eliminate his rivals. 227 gangsters were killed in 4 years. Capone tried to get rid of his biggest rival, Bugs Moran, on the 14th of February, 1929, when he sent 2 hitmen, dressed as police, into the gang. This became known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. As 7 of the gang were killed, Moran survived, but retired soon after. In 1931, Al was sentenced to 11 years in prison for not paying tax. Although he was released in 1939 with a brain disease, he was so ill that he was said to have been fishing in his swimming pool in his final days. He died in 1947 from a heart attack. Next up in this section is immigration. Millions around the world, but particularly from Eastern and Southern Europe, saw America as an opportunity to start a new life, often fleeing poverty, famine, and persecution, or just wanting a better life. 40 million people, around 10% of Europe's population, moved to America between 1850 and 1914, the largest ever recorded movement of people. There are many factors that persuaded people to move, including the vast size of America, with lots of natural resources and cheap farmland. Leading industries, including coal, steel, and textiles, offered jobs and businesses. People could practice any religion freely, and many European towns and cities were overcrowded. Land was scarce. The immigrants had significant impacts in America, bringing with them a multitude of new cultures, cuisines, and ways of living. These groups often collected in communities as part of large cities, the effects of which can still be seen today. However, not everyone liked the new immigrants. They were often poor, didn't speak English well, and had unfamiliar, often religious, practices. Many were afraid of foreigners post-World War I, thinking that they may try to take over. The immigrants themselves often had varying experiences. Some were very successful, opening businesses and fulfilling their dreams, while many struggled significantly. Working and living conditions were often poor, with low wages in bad jobs because of their limited education, and many faced severe discrimination. Soon, America became less welcoming to immigrants, placing restrictions on their entry. Many who were uneducated were unable to pass the literacy test, so sent back home, before a 350,000 limit was imposed in 1921 under the immigration quota law. The National Origins Act cut this further to 150,000 in 1924. It was not just the immigrants that faced discrimination in the 1920s though, so did many African Americans. Lynchings, illegal hangings, occurred frequently in southern states, with many of the victims innocent but murdered regardless. Justice wasn't the motivator. As we previously mentioned, slavery was abolished in 1865, and by this time there were more black people than white in the southern states. White politicians tried to maintain power over the black population by introducing a Jim Crow laws, stopping African Americans from using the same hotels, libraries, taxis, and cemeteries as white people, and more. Difficult literacy tests and high taxes stopped many being able to vote as well. Additionally, they were segregated if in the military, stopped from marrying other races, and denied justice from the legal system. As a result, almost 2 million African Americans migrated north, away from the strong racism. They still faced discrimination though. Low pay, frequent firings from jobs, and poor living conditions were just a few of the numerous struggles that millions faced. Race riots were sparked occasionally too, such as when an African American accidentally went onto a white-only beach. Some communities, however, did very well in their new lives. Talented poets, writers, musicians, and artists made a name for themselves, especially in large cities like New York. White people were attracted to these areas that boasted jazz bars, nightclubs, and a lively atmosphere. Many refer to this as the Black Renaissance. The National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP, set up by the great-grandson of an African slave, helped improve the rights of African Americans through a number of campaigns. Despite the politicians' initial refusal to act, the association still exists today and is very popular. Many African Americans, and others, faced persecution from racist groups such as the KKK, Ku Klux Klan. This was a white supremacist party, revived in 1915, with over 5 million members by 1925, made up of mainly white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, or WASPs. African Americans were the main target of the intimidation and violence of the KKK, although Jews and Catholics were often terrorized and murdered. With white robes, large white hoods and American flags, the members brutally tortured and murdered thousands. The membership fell quickly after 1925, as the secrets began to become more well known. Next up is the Red Scare, a term used to describe the fear that many felt about the threat of communism in America. Millions migrated from Central and Eastern Europe, as well as Japan and China, who were seen as a threat to America because of their radically different culture. Many Americans felt that the Europeans were bringing communism with them to America, and that it would take over the country like it had done in Russia. The tension continued to build, as an American Communist Party was created, and much of the Boston police force went on strike, the communists being blamed. Alexander Mitchell Palmer, head of the American Law and Police, had his home bombed by a communist. Anarchists, people who believed that countries should not be run by powerful governments, were also feared, especially after an anarchist killed President William McKinley in 1901. This combination of factors sparked the Palmer raids, an attempt to get rid of communists in America. 6,000 suspected communists were arrested and put in prison, ending the Red Scare. Although trade union membership declined as a result, many saw the unions as against the American ideas of business. In the final element of this section of the course, we are going to talk about two Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti, who did not speak English very well. The two men were anarchists, and accused of murdering 2 staff in a factory and stealing $15,000. There were many pieces of evidence for their defense, including 107 testimonies that they weren't there and disagreements between witnesses, but also much against them, like 61 eyewitnesses and the claim that the two apparently acted guilty upon their arrest, lying to the police. The two were sentenced to death by electric chair 45 days after the trial began. There were years of protests, as the case was published all over the world, but the two were still executed in 1927 despite the obviously racist conviction. The governor of Massachusetts issued a formal pardon 50 years later. And that's the end of part 1 of the course. Have a look on the Revision Realm channel for the other 2 parts to complete your learning. If you found this helpful, send it to your fellow students so that they can benefit too. If there is anything that you think I could improve, add, or change, let me know. Thanks for watching.